afternoon, everyone. I'm Linda Dixon from the Lexington Veterans Association, and I welcome you to a presentation on Elusive Victory, Year 4 of the Russo-Ukraine War. We also welcome our fellow veterans who are viewing this program from the Edith Norris Rogers Memorial Veterans Hospital in Bedford, Massachusetts, and our fellow veterans from the Brockton VA Medical Center, hosted by Jennifer Cole, medical librarian for the VA Boston Healthcare System. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Leonid Kondratiuk. After serving 2 years as a field artillery officer, upon graduating from the Citadel, Brigadier General Kondratiuk joined the Massachusetts Army National Guard as military historian. Soon after, his talents were needed in Washington, D.C., as at the National Guard Bureau. He worked as senior military historian for 20 years, taking time out for tours as faculty member at the Army War College and public affairs officer. He retired at the rank of colonel in 1999, and he was promoted to brigadier general in 2007. In retirement, he speaks often about the situation in Ukraine, and he communicates regularly with family members there. A member of the National Lancers and a skilled horseman, he has played the role of Paul Revere each year on Patriots' Day. We probably didn't recognize him, riding into Lexington on horseback to spread the alarm of the approaching British troops. So please give a warm welcome to Leonid Kondratiuk.
Well, say hello to my welcome veteran, some fellow veterans, Brookhaven residents here. Glad to have you here. Nice to have you here. And all right, I guess we'll go with the first map of Ukraine. I'm going to move around a bit, so I want you to see the map when it comes up. Here it is. Thank you. So before the war, there were 43 million people living in Ukraine. It's the largest country in Europe. It's the size of Texas, not well known. It borders, you can see where it borders, unfortunately, it borders Russia, Belarus, Poland, the Czech Republic, Romania, Moldova, and good relations with them, not so great with the Russians. You probably heard that Ukraine has these rare earth minerals. We'll talk about that later. And by the way, I'm going to have a shorter presentation because there's going to be a lot of comments and questions, right? And we don't leave room for that, time for that rather. I did graduate work at Kansas State. They had a history department that specialized in military history. And I didn't know till later that the wheat grown in Kansas came from Ukraine. And so the wheat, the wheat that's produced in the Midwest is Ukrainian wheat. You say, how did it get there? It came from German Mennonites that went from Ukraine. It was a big colony of Germans. And the Tsar said, you can leave Ukraine, but don't you take anything else with you. And you know what they did? They stuffed those all those grains and whatever you need to grow. And they brought them with them to Kansas, and that's where they grew the wheat that's produced in the Midwest today. I gotta switch to my glasses. It's a rich industrial country as well, especially in the East. And speaking of wheat, it is one of the biggest wheat producers in the world. Asia, Africa depends on Ukrainian wheat. And during the first year of the Ukraine-Russo war, people were starving in Africa because the wheat wasn't getting out. And that's still the situation. A lot of the wheat not coming out of the country. All right, we'll go to the next map, just briefly. See the present situation. And about 20% of Ukraine is captured by the Russians in red. 4 oblasts, or 4 like states / counties, are under their control. 2 completely, 2 not so completely. And of course, Crimea, which they Russians took in 2014 without essentially firing a shot. So that's the situation is today. I'll talk about the Kursk salient. So if you go to Kharkiv in the extreme northeast, it's just northeast of that, and that's a part of Russia that Ukraine controls. We'll talk about that as well. Oh, I got the little, oh, you can do the slides with me? Yeah, okay, you can go to the next slide. A little bit of history of Ukraine. Obviously, I'm Ukrainian descent. My mother and father were born there. They got out right after World War II. And I was born in England, and I came through Ellis Island, which I didn't know until my wife and I visited Ellis Island. I put my name in the computer, boom, I came up. How about that? So, little history for his one for you. I discovered this a couple of years ago. Around 3,500 BC, the Yamna tribe, which is a Ukrainians, invented the wheeled cart. And you go, okay, well, that's one of the greatest inventions in human civilization. Why is that? Because up to that time, everybody was a farmer, right? And now with the wheeled cart, you could have towns and the farmers could bring their produce to the town, right? And this invention of the wheeled cart went all the way through Europe and all the way to India. And as a result, that language spoken way back when in 3,500 BC, Indo-European, came from Ukraine, and it spread all over. So Indo-European originally was spoken in Ukraine. And you can see Kievan Rus was the empire, the Ukrainian empire, that ruled that all the way from the Baltics all the way almost to the Black Sea. So it was a fairly large empire, well developed, became a Christian nation in 988, adopted the Eastern Orthodox religion. And because Ukraine is such fertile, it's flat, great lands that you could easily take over, and you could see all the various countries and groups that have invaded Ukraine over the years. I will tell you that the Mongols were bad. I'm 1% Mongol, by the way. One of my great grandmothers couldn't run fast enough. And the other 1% of me is Viking. You go, Viking, how's that? Because the original rulers of Ukraine were Scandinavians. How about that? The worst rulers I would put up there are the Germans and the Russians. We'll speak about that. It was independent only for a few short years. And I want to talk about Stalin. So for Stalin, collectivized farms. Stalin, Ukraine was always resistant to Russian rule, Bolshevik rule or Stalin's rule. So he was going to break, the vast majority of Ukrainians were farmers, the peasants. He was going to break them. What was he going to do? He was going to take the farms away from them and have collectivized farms, okay? Where nobody owned anything, you all worked for the state. And in order to do that, he increased the grain levy on all the peasants. Because what was he doing with this? He was selling this all over Europe to make money to build factories in the East. And so from 1932 to 1933, he seized all the grain produce, leaving nothing for the peasants, and 4 to 5 million Ukrainian peasants died. It's a large number. And I'll tell you a personal story. My mother was living in a small village. There were 4 kids in her family, and her mother threw her and her other sister out into the woods because she couldn't feed them. So for 2 months, my mother traveled the countryside trying to get something to eat until things got better. 1939, Stalin comes into the Western Ukraine, which was part of Poland at the time, and he arrested probably over 1 million, not only Ukrainians, but also Poles, because they lived there as well. And in 1939, my grandmother was executed for being an enemy of the state. What was her crime? She was married to somebody on a list that the KGB had for elimination. My grandfather, he got away, she didn't. So my story is not unusual family stories, but my family lived through Ukrainian history as it's living through present times today in Kiev, where I have an aunt and cousins. 10 million more Ukrainians died. Now get this, from 1914 to 1945, 20 to 25 million Ukrainians died in the various wars and the Holodomor, as they call the famine. And that's why the population in Ukraine is so small. I said it was 43 million beginning of the war. It's around 35 million now because so many millions have left as refugees. So it was a tough situation. Finally, they became independent in 1991, and things were tough initially. Things were getting better, and then the war breaks out on February 24th, 2022. We'll start the slide presentation. So what led to the war? Next slide, please. Well, one man started this war. One man, Vladimir Putin. And why did he decide to invade Ukraine? Well, he was the first reason, 2014, his puppet president of Ukraine was forced out. And Yanukovych, the president, was forced out because he was pro-Russian, and Ukraine was supposed to sign an agreement with the EU, European Union, to become a member, and he reneged at the last minute. There was big demonstrations in Kiev that went on for months and months, and finally he left. And what Putin saw that as a slap in his face by the Ukrainians. And also he was personally threatened because he didn't want this movement to spread into Russia. We all know about Navalny, right? Died over a year ago. He didn't want to see that happen in Ukraine. Putin went on a rant, and this is the classic Russian rant that there's no such thing as Ukraine. It never existed, will never exist, and all they are is the stepchildren of the Russians. Not true, but that's the way he sees history. And you can see the next bullet on there that without Ukraine, there is no Russian Empire, which is part of his plan to recreate the Russian Empire. The actual war starts in 2014, which is in a low-level war, but still 14,000 Ukrainians died in that war. That continued all the way into 2020. It was a little ceasefire that went on for a couple of years, but 3 weeks ago, I had lunch with 2 Ukrainian army officers here in Boston. They're on leave. And one was a chaplain. And I said, how long has your unit been in combat, chaplain? He said, since 2014. And he was with them for about 10 years. I could see his face was haggard. And they finally, from frontline duty for so many years, it's a long time to be in action. And the bottom line, Russia does not want Ukraine to exist. As a people, state, got a typo there, as a religion, and its race, its history and culture. Go, next slide, please. As I said, the war began 3 years ago. This is now the 4th year. The Russian army came from 9 different directions. But there were pundits in Washington and Putin as well, thinking that the war was going to end in 3 days, no more than 2 weeks, right? Now we're into year 4. He misread the Ukrainians. He didn't think there wasn't much of an army. The people weren't going to resist. He thought the people would welcome him with open arms, and that's what he took. The generals told some of the Russian soldiers, "Oh, don't worry about it. You're going to be seen as liberators." In fact, some Russian generals and colonels packed their full dress uniforms in their suitcases and their duffel bags, thinking they were going to lead the parade in Kiev as the great liberators of Ukraine. The Russian army, here we thought in the United States that the second best army in the world is the Russian army. U.S. Army is the best. U.S. Armed Forces are the best. The Russian army, when Putin took over, the Russian army was in terrible condition. It was untrained, basically untrained. No modern doctrine. It was a draftee army largely, and the officer leadership wasn't very good. And a lot of money was spent on improving the Russian army, getting new weapons, new equipment, building new barracks, and a lot of that money was stolen by various colonels and generals. A lot of corruption in the Russian army, even to this day. As it turned out, there was a great line I had in the last talk I gave a couple of years ago. Turned out the Russian army was the second best in Ukraine. And it was lack of discipline, lack of training. The generalship was terrible. And the Ukrainians took advantage of that. And you can see the other bullets on there. Not enough units, poor logistical support, poor medical support. and terrible generalship. When the Russian soldiers came into Ukraine, they thought they were, this accounts for, I'll talk about some of the war crimes committed, but not a good army, much better today, but with many untrained recruits. We'll go to the next slide, please. I'll just go with these little, I don't want to, as a military historian, I like to tell the history of wars, right? And we'll just spend a few minutes on this and the various phases of the war. But the first phase, where the Ukrainians are on the defensive, Kiev is almost, the capital is almost taken. Zelensky was on a hit list. There were 20 Spetsnaz, a dozen Spetsnaz groups, Russian special forces gunning for him. They're all killed, these Russians. The airport outside the city, which was going to be the landing point for the Russian paratroops and helicopter troops to come in, was blown up by the Ukrainians. The Russian paratroops were wiped out. And the second phase of coming in from the north, from Belarus, was also defeated. Remember watching television, a 40-mile long column that wasn't moving? Yeah. Remember that one? Well, that was coming from the north heading for Kiev. And the reason why they couldn't move is, ready for this? They ran out of gas, ran out of diesel. That's how inefficient and terrible the logistical system was. The Russian soldiers, and a lot of time, they were taking gas out of the vehicles, trying to sell to local farmers for food, because they weren't getting fed either. It was just, and that column eventually had to somehow turn around, go back all to Belarus. So, and that was into June 2022. The BTG, that's a battalion tactical group. The Russian army is based on battalions, about a 600-man unit with tank support, some artillery, engineer support, and so on. The doctrine for those battalions don't work for the Russian army, and those battalions are defeated. Now, if you look at the next group, the Ukrainians react quickly. We're celebrating the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, started in Lexington. And who are those soldiers that fought the British? They were the militia. They were the Minutemen, right? And in Ukraine, forms militia and Minutemen within weeks. And untrained civilians are given rifles and going to fight the Russians, and that's what they do. And those units of militia and Minutemen are organized as regular units of the Ukrainian army months later, but they initially go in with little training. But the bottom bullet, July to September, Ukraine goes on the offensive, starts pushing the Russians out. And all right, the next slide, please. And I think it's going to be, yeah, sorry about that for the people on the back. I didn't realize that my font went got smaller. But anyway, if you look on there, the Russians are now incurring thousands of casualties because we've all seen the movies of World War I, right? Where they're coming in mass formation, trying to attack, right? The Russians do that. They go in open formation against the Ukrainians in some cases until they learn how to fight the Ukrainians better than that. Let's go to the present. The Ukrainians invade Russia in August of last year. And the Ukrainians are hanging on that piece of Kursk Oblast Russian, hanging on there. Why did Zelensky go in there? It was a bargaining chip. If you got a piece of Russia, maybe Putin will maybe agree to give up a part of Ukraine. But so right now, we'll talk about that a little bit later. So for 2023 to this time, the Russians are taking severe casualties because they're going in formations. The Ukrainians are battering them with artillery. And the biggest killer in the battlefield, World War I, by the way, I'll give you a teaching point. The biggest battlefield killer in World War I, World War II was artillery. Today it's drones. Drones are killing Russians by the thousands. Ukrainians are the most experienced and best operators of drones. The Russians are pretty good at it too. But fortunately, the Ukrainians are much better. And they have these kamikaze drones, they can crash in and kill the Russians advancing. So that's what's going on now. And what I should have mentioned, and I didn't, is another for the Russian failure the first 2 years of the war was doctrine. How do you fight? Okay, that's doctrine. Even though the Russians had a book on how to fight, they're taught to their officers and so on, they could not synchronize the infantry with the tanks, with aviation. They couldn't do that. And if they had done that, they could have probably won the war in the first year, but they couldn't do it. They just couldn't get all three of those components to fight at the same time to advance against you. Ukrainians have no tactical error. They got they got a few F-16s and a couple of Russian fighters, got a few helicopters, but the Russians are deathly afraid. The Russian Air Force will not fly over Ukraine because they know they'll get shot down. Because the air defense weapons that we've sent the Ukrainians are working, but the Russians are still launching missiles every day against Ukraine. I'll tell you a story. My cousin Larissa went through about 6, 7, 8 months ago. She's walking down the street Saturday after doing her shopping, and all of a sudden she hears a loud explosion, and shattered glass just falls all over her. She thought she was dying. And that loud boom that she had heard was a Ukrainian fighter jet shooting down a drone. But the drone crashed into a building, hence all the glass came down. Imagine that, doing your shopping, and next thing you're enveloped by, you're in the war. Ukraine's had a tough time last year, but the Russians have incurred up to this point 750,000 casualties. Imagine that, 750,000. There's 140 million population. Russians 140 million. They cannot sustain these casualties. They're running out of men, just as Ukrainians are. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Okay, and you see Ukraine's got no ammunition, no weapons for most part of 2024 due to congressional inaction. All right, next slide. Russian way of war, I just go over that very briefly. Overwhelming artillery barrage, missile strikes, drone strikes. The second bullet, deliberate attacks on civilians. You've seen them, you've seen everything on TV. Apartment buildings, hospitals, energy plants. Putin thought if you take out all the energy plants, put the Ukrainians in the dark, that you'd break the will of the civilian people. My wife over there, Sandra, she bought her family a generator so they could have light at night. And people make, everybody in Ukraine lives in apartment buildings. You've seen all these blown up apartment buildings. That's what they live in the cities. And if you take out the electricity, you got to walk up. My 86-year-old aunt lives in the 8th floor of an apartment building. She can't walk up and down stairs. For a while in Kiev, the major city, and other cities last year, they would have no heat, no light, and no water for weeks at a time. So how do you live like that? Somehow they did it, but Putin didn't break their will, as the bottom bullet says. This chaplain that I met 2 weeks ago, they brought him in from the front, and what he does now, he has a foundation. He operates 13 shelters for abused women in Ukraine, rape, torture, and so on. Russian soldiers, very brutal. Why is that? Because they don't want to be there. They don't have discipline, and nobody can stop them from shooting defenseless civilians. They just do it. Their officers don't care. Their generals don't care. Another way of breaking the will of the Ukrainian people. Now, though, we think those orders came from the Kremlin. Kill civilians if you want to. Terrible, terrible situation. The one that gets me is Frontline did a special a few months ago about the kidnapping of the Ukrainian children. We don't know how many kidnapped Ukrainian children are, 25 to 50,000. Some have said as many as 100,000. I don't know. But why are the Russians kidnapping Ukrainians? Because they have a very low birth rate. And so, and Putin's twisted mind, he thinks if he kidnaps Ukrainian kids, it'll be more Russians. Now he's indicted war criminal as a result of that. And fourth, Russification in the occupied areas. Schools teach all the teachers have been replaced by Russians. The cops are Russians. Everybody in the government in that part of the 20% of Ukraine are Russian officials, forcing everybody's become a Russian citizen. They got Russian passports. They're not allowed to call themselves Ukrainians. If they do, they can be jailed. Many of the former city and town officials, oblast officials, were arrested or executed and are sitting in prison somewhere in Russia. Okay, next slide, please. Just briefly about the Ukrainian army, they're based on the NATO. When I led the first, I was executive officer of the first deployment of US troops into Ukraine in 1993. And what we found, and of course, the Ukrainian army was largely a Soviet model, right? Because that's all they knew and that's all they were equipped and trained with. But over the years, NATO, and especially US Army, US National Guard, Canada, UK sent in training teams from 2014 all the way up to 2022, teaching the Ukrainians how to fight NATO style, a NATO style model of army. What does that include? I mean, it includes well-trained junior officers, lieutenants, captains, and something the Russians don't have, I didn't mention, they don't have an NCO corps. They have guys that get paid as sergeants, but they're not sergeants. The Ukrainian army, the sergeants actually lead, are leaders and work with the officers. Cyber, drones, mission command, what does that mean? It means in the Russian army, no one takes initiative on the battlefield. They're waiting for orders. The captain's sitting there waiting for orders from the lieutenant colonel. Lieutenant colonel sits there waiting for orders from the division commander, not taking advantage of the tactical situation. Ukrainians are trained to be on the initiative, and they do, and they are. They have serious manpower issues. The Ukrainian army at the beginning of the war was only 200,000. It's around 800,000 now, but those are not all troops on the front line because you got troops training, you got wounded troops, and you got troops in Germany that are being trained. So then we think that the Russian army has about, by the way, on the battlefield, about 600,000 troops. And it's along the 700-mile front. The Ukrainians, I'm guessing they have maybe 500,000. They won't say they're very cagey about the man. But the Ukrainian, because there was a low birth rate in Ukraine as well, the military age, our typical US Army soldier is 19 or 20. The Ukrainian army, the average age is 42. Those captains that I was dealing with, they were age 50. One of the captains was telling me when he was on the front, he had a recon sergeant that was age 60. And it's an old army, and you can see that on TV. They all look old because they are old. And because of, and Zelensky's husbanding, he's very careful with the young men, because if you send them into the grinder, you won't have a generation. And so he's very careful. So the draft age in Ukraine, minimum draft age was 27 until last summer. Now it's 25. And they are drafting because they have to. They're running out of men. And they fought, they're weary, they're tired, but they fought the Russians mostly to a stand. It's a stalemate today on the battlefield. The Ukrainians, as we speak, the Ukrainian army is attacking in certain directions, certain pockets. The Russian army is also attacking in certain areas, but not getting very far. In November, December, when the Russians were attacking, they were losing 1,000 to 1,500 men per day. You can't sustain that, and Putin knows that. Okay, next slide. Yeah, I kind of, we'll go to the North Koreans. Imagine that. Putin had to go to North Korea to recruit troops. And those North Koreans, when they came in January, 12,000 of them. By the end of the month, there were only 6,000 left. Ukrainians have wiped them out, had a fallback, reorganized. They're back on the battlefield now. Again, issues concerning weapons, I'll talk about that a little bit later. And the 700,000 casualties. Next slide, please. Just to show you what the losses, the Russians are running out of equipment as well. That's why they have had to import the ammunition from North Korea. And you can see all the losses that they've taken. It's tremendous loss. Now, they had a whole bunch of tanks and armored fighting vehicles in their depots. And when the Russian army went to go there to open the depots, get the tanks going, put them on rail cars, and they found out most of the engines were missing. They had been cannibalized, thousands of tanks over the years. So it took them a long time to get some of their old weapons on the battlefield. That's how corrupt they are. US weapons sent to Ukraine. Next slide, please. Those of you Cold War veterans like myself, Vietnam veterans, look at the M113 armored personnel carrier. We're all familiar with that. We had thousands of them sitting in the National Guard, Army Reserve, and other places, and they were good vehicles in their time. But we sent them to Ukraine. The better ones are the Bradley Fighting Vehicle 300. But the biggest, I talked to all the Ukrainian officers about the M77 155 millimeter howitzer. We sent them 200. It's probably the finest artillery gun in the world. In fact, two of them came from the Massachusetts National Guard, went to Ukraine. Because we try to send them as many of those howitzers as we can. The Javelin's that tank killer, the missile tank killer. And critical weapons for the Ukrainians were the air defense missiles. Okay, still critical. They don't have enough of them. That's why the Russians keep sending their Iranian drones and their missiles. So you could get a lot of bottom figure. The figure I'm comfortable with is 86 billion to about I'm pretty comfortable with that figure. US aid, military aid sent to Ukraine. Look at the bottom bullet. 90% of that money was spent in the United States. How? For weapons, for defense contractors. We have army ammunition plants, went to pay for the ammunition being made and so on. $1 billion was spent just alone in the state of Massachusetts. So we didn't send them a check, all right? The MAGA people will tell you, oh, what happened to all that missing money? It was spent in the United States. That's where it was. Okay. Present situation. Next slide, please. This is kind of a recap where we are. Russia advanced that much 2024. Russians are sustaining serious casualties. Manpower issues I talked about. Ukrainians are dependent on US aid and largely on defensive, even though in some cases they're on the attack. Look at that bottom bullet. Who spent more money on the Ukrainians, the US or the European partners? By far, it's the European partners. And we talk about GNP. Look at the countries in the Baltic, sending a great portion of their GNP, not for their defense, for Ukrainian defense. So that's something. Next slide. Okay, here's what's Putin demanding, just to come to the table, okay? The administration has made no defense, has not went to Russia, to Putin, the Kremlin, and made demands on them to come to the table. But this is what Putin demands, just to start negotiations. He wants to demobilize the Ukrainian army, he wants to take their heavy weapons away, and to make all these promises. And what is his outcome, his strategic goal? It's right there, that bottom bullet. And he wants to separate the United States from Europe, and that's what's going on as we speak. Big strategic winning. The present administration goes along with that. Next slide, US demands on Ukraine. This is what the Trump administration is demanding from Ukraine. I don't know about the mineral. As last week, the Trump administration suspended all US military assistance, ammunition, and equipment to Ukraine. Stopped most intelligence assets to the Ukrainians. And Linda, you asked me what was the latest. Friday night, Saturday morning, they shut off the satellites that the Ukrainians were getting for satellite intelligence. So right now the Ukrainians are blind. Even though they have long-range missiles, they can't use them into Russia. They cannot attempt because the Trump administration shut off the lights. And Douglas Lute, former US ambassador to NATO, said it best. If you're looking for a strategy for the Trump administration, guess what? There is no strategy. That was a great quote. Let's see, we're good for the next slide. What the Ukrainians want, continued US military aid. They can't continue the war without US military aid. Yeah, the Europeans are going to give them some. You know, predictions are the Ukrainians can make their way through the summer of 2025. I think, knowing them, I think they can make it into the fall, maybe into next year without US aid. But this is what they're looking for. And the bottom one is what the most important one is for them. US guarantees of security. 1994, President Clinton told the Ukrainians, I want you to disarm your nuclear weapons. Ukrainians said, okay, but I want you to guarantee Ukraine's sovereign borders. He said, no problem. US signed it, UK signed it, and Russia signed it, and Ukraine signed it, okay? There were other agreements to start for a ceasefire in Minsk. that didn't hold up either. So is the United States willing for that US guarantee? No, no, they're not. Next slide. All right, the last one. I know in the Pentagon, we call this death by PowerPoint. So most of your eyes are open over there. So thank you for staying with me. It's after lunch, I know. Putin will fight to the last Russian. Here's the other thing, the second bullet. If there is a ceasefire, he's going to take a year out to reorganize, refit, rearm, and invade Ukraine again. He's not going to give up. The only way he's going to give up when he's dead. And that's right now, as a result, what happened at the White House a couple of weeks ago, 62%. I'm pretty comfortable with that figure. Percent of the American people are in favor of supporting Ukraine. And the last couple bullets, you can read that Trump risks diminishing America's standing in the world. He reneges on Ukraine as an unreliable partner. But Russia has not broken the Ukrainian people. They're strong. I asked one of those Ukrainian officers I had lunch with, and he said, "Don't worry, don't panic. Ukraine's been around a long time. We'll figure this out." And I think that's my last slide. So I'll take questions.
Jim Ramsey, where are you?
He's over there. I got a question.
Jim, would you be my partner and grab another mic and take that part of the room? One second. And by the way, anybody with a question, raise your hand. We will bring the microphone to you so that you will be recorded. Okay? Go.
Look at that. As far as I'm concerned about NATO, it's like we need NATO. United States needs NATO. And all of us should support that. Because if we don't support that, there'll be a huge war. Okay. And it really burns me to see Trump doing what he's doing. He's the worst president ever in the whole world. So he should be a used car salesman. That's what he should be. He's useless.
Yeah, thank you.
I take my hat off to the Ukrainians because of the fact they're a small place and they defeated Russia, whether they like it or not. Russia is weak right now, and we should be supporting them a great deal. Happy that we.
Thank you for that. I just want to make one comment. I used to teach military history to National Guard students at Camp Edwards on the Cape. And I would ask them, and some of them were veterans of the Afghan war, and I would ask them, do you know why the other countries were there? And they would say no. And I said, because after 9/11, the NATO countries supported the United States. They sent troops to Afghanistan. And I think NATO is very important. You see, a great commentator on television is Admiral Stavridis, former SAC hero, former commander of NATO, strong supporter, but really, if you happen to see him on CNN or something, I would tell you to pay attention. And he believes in NATO as well. Thank you.
I'll start by making a comment as a proud French American, of course. Trump doesn't risk diminishing America's standing in the world. He has lost America's standing in the world. I have family in France and around Europe, and I can't believe that the country I moved to is now, they don't count on the US anymore because they can't.
Yeah, who's America's oldest ally? The answer is France. They supported us in 1777. Last week, President Macron, to his credit, said, I will send French peacekeepers to Ukraine. And oh, by the way, I have nuclear weapons as well.
Mhm.
You know, if Putin can rattle the saber, President Macron did. So thank you to the people of France and French president. Next question.
We're 3 years into the war, and I don't understand, what does the winner win? I mean, it's the Europeans are unable to defend themselves. we have 5,000 American peacekeepers in Kosovo right now, because the Europeans can't even police their own backyard. And so if Russia occupies Ukraine, is that going to be satisfactory? Certainly not to the Ukrainians. But what happens if Russia loses? And is that a possibility? And what happens to
Yeah,
the world peace
Okay.
at that point?
yeah, Kosovo is a NATO mission, by the way. There are other troops from other countries there as well. They've been there since.
It's a shame
They've
America
been
has
there.
to
Well,
police
it's part of NATO, sir, so it has a commitment, so it's a NATO mission. NATO mission means 30 countries send troops there, and they have to this day. Yeah, maybe minimal, but they're now trying to keep the Kosovans apart from each other and not kill themselves. But if part of Russia, if they lose, I hope they do. You know what? They'll have a revolution. Maybe one of these days they'll get rid of Putin, so whatever. Yes, sir.
No, hang on.
Oh, we got another
Jim is
question in the
next.
back. All right.
With the war going on, has Ukraine been able to develop any of their own substantial artillery or small arms ammo production?
Yes, they are. As we speak, they've opened up new, Ukrainians, by the way, Ukrainian was also an arsenal for the Soviet Union. Tanks were made there, missiles were made there. When I mean missiles, I mean ICBMs. The largest aircraft in the world were made there till the Russians blew them up. So it had an arms industry, and it was an arms, selling arms. And a lot of those factories were bombed, of course, but they're reopening their industrial military complex. Yes, they are. And again, they're the largest manufacturer of military drones in the world. So yeah, they're making all sorts of things, and yeah, there's some ammo. To start ammo production. Listen to this. We were making very few rounds. Being in the artillery, the standard round is a 155 millimeter shell. It's 100 pounds. I know that because I loaded plenty of them, and we were making like 10,000, 15,000 rounds a year. That was it. Okay, now we're making 800 to 1,000,000 rounds a year because the Ukrainians are doing it. And that's also increasing our stocks. We can go into a war because we didn't have enough ammunition for the US Army. So I guess, okay, does that answer your question, my VMI classmate over there?
Thank you for your excellent presentation, because this is all a lot to think about. May I ask, since your presentation was basically what each side is doing wrong, can you tell us what your opinion is of what it would take to get to peace between those three partners, or those three combatants?
Oh, boy.
Ukraine, Russia, and America. What can they do to get to peace?
I wish I was smart enough to answer that, and I can't. What would it take? It would, 2 years ago, when I gave this talk, my pat answer was whoever runs out of beans and bullets and men first. And to some extent, that's true. They're gonna exhaust themselves. Is that one scenario? I think, but again, I said Putin will fight to the last Russian. So what does peace look like? What does victory look like? I don't know. And maybe the Trump administration will force Putin to come to the table. Maybe there'll be some sort of ceasefire that this war can end at least temporarily. I don't know. I'm not banking on that. I'm thinking this thing is going to go on and on. Trump is not the great. I don't know what is in Trump's mind, but forcing the Ukrainians to some extent, blinding them and disarming them to a great extent. That's not an answer.
I think this, from the Trump standpoint, is all based on him getting half the metals and material.
Well, that was part of the deal. Yeah. That's, by the way, that's never going to happen for many reasons.
Okay, next.
How significant are the so-called rare earth minerals
They're not.
in Ukraine?
They're not, because they're extracting well, again, one of the biggest industries in Ukraine was coal mining. All right, what are you gonna do with that? But there's some rare earth there, and there's some industries extracting some of that. Well, my question is, how are you gonna get the infrastructure to set that up? How's it gonna be extracted from, by the way, Ukrainian, we're gonna load it on ships from Odessa? Well, the Russians are blockading the ships. So how's it gonna get to the United States? So I don't see that as really happening. You know, maybe it looks good on paper and I'm glad Zelensky will sign that because it's a swap. You know, here, Trump, you want it? Here it is. Do with it what you want. And he wants, you know, 350 billion back from the Ukrainians. Well, I just showed you the slide.
Thank you.
86, 90 billion that was spent. Anyway.
Another comment, you're talking about, someone asked who's winning? That's a very good question. I can tell you who's losing. Who's losing? Europe. Why? Because do you think that Putin will stop at Ukraine? The Baltic states are already nervous. Who's next? Poland. Whether or not they're part of NATO doesn't make it damn different. What's gonna happen after that? During World War II, the Americans were involved, which stopped the Russians from going westwards further than they were already. If the Americans lay down, where are they gonna stop? Why not Germany? Why not France? Why not the whole continent? So if you have family in Europe, that gets you very nervous. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm done.
To what extent is China a player, albeit in the background?
Well, they're buying, how does Putin keep, well, there's a two-phase answer to that. How does Putin keep paying for his war machine? He's selling oil to India, China, whatever. And so that Russians are getting, you know, getting cash. But the Chinese, they're not neutral. Here's what they're doing. You know, all these little parts and wires and everything else that you need to make drones, China's selling it to Russia and to the Ukrainians. Very clever people. 2 weeks ago, the United States voted against Ukraine in the United Nations. Remember that? And who voted along with the United States? North Korea, Haiti, African countries that don't like us, Iran, and China abstained. This is interesting.
I was thinking also as a geopolitical threat to the United States that needs to be paying attention to it as well as all the other challenges we've got.
Yeah. Of course, you know, the Trump administration now the defense is oriented toward fighting China, by the way. And that started with the Biden administration, and they're continuing that. I tell her Russia is not our friend. I see it, you know, could it be, obviously it's a potential enemy. Do I see a war with China? But that's where we're putting all our eggs right now.
Can Ukraine continue to effectively fight with only European support, without any US support?
Very good question. I think they can for this year and maybe part of next year. But eventually the weapon systems that we've sent them will wear out. You know, the ammunition that we make, we're not going to be sending them, so they're going to have to rely on new artillery, new weapons, new artillery weapon systems. However, Putin wants to take all of Eastern Ukraine, and he doesn't want Western Ukraine. But Western Ukraine is extremely nationalistic, doesn't want that, wants Ukraine to be a rump state. In other words, only a small portion of what it is. But something you didn't know, when the Red Army took over Ukraine during World War II, there was a Ukrainian partisan army that fought the Reds into the 1950s. So my point is, there would be partisan warfare in all of Ukraine. Eventually, the Russians will be defeated, you know, and they'll have to leave like they left in Afghanistan. So I think, you know, they might, even if they take some more land, in the long run, I think they're going to lose.
Hang on, just
From one of the lectures I've been to, there's 9 routes into Russia where they've been attacked. from different Mongols, whatever, through history. And the speaker indicated that plugging up those routes was Putin's first issue, not going into France or Germany or anything, but just to plug up the old 9 invasion routes that they've experienced before. End of comment.
I remember, years ago, I was in, Poland, I think it was, no. Yeah, Poland, Lithuania. I spent a week there. And they brought me to, the river that Napoleon's army crossed the river to invade Russia. And yeah, there was certainly invasion routes, as you say, that we used over the centuries. But again, the army I spent a long time with, the Cold War army, you know, we knew where the Russians were going to invade the West, and we weren't worried. We weren't worried so much as invading them as we were Russians coming across. So I don't know. A long-winded answer is I don't know about that, but there are many, historically, there've been, as you say, many invasion routes into Russia. In fact, the Ukrainians found one last summer when they went into Russia.
Next question.
Is there a significant part of the population of Ukraine that wants to be part of Russia?
Yeah, and they're gone now because they've been incorporated in those eastern oblasts that Putin has taken over. And let me talk about that eastern Donetsk, Luhansk. Historically, the countryside was made up of Ukrainians, but the cities were made up of Russian speakers. Many of them were Ukrainians that had been Russified, and others were Russians that Stalin put in there in the 1930s. And a large portion of them were pro-Russian. That's why they started fighting the Ukrainians in 2014, because their guy was kicked out as president. And you could argue for the 2014, 2015, it was a kind of a civil war. But then Putin sent his Russian soldiers in. And what happened to the Ukrainians who were fighting for Putin? He forced them into the Russian army. They're all dead now. Payback by the Ukrainians. The other thing the war has done, and I'm glad you brought this up, is where Ukrainian, up until 2022, Ukraine was kind of split in sections. There was a Russian-speaking section that were Ukrainians, Russians. There was a very pro-nationalist section, very pro-Ukrainian, because they were the last ones to become part of Ukraine in the West. And then you had the center that was, could speak Russian, could speak Ukrainian, like my family. And that war has now made the Ukrainian nation. And where Putin wanted to split the Ukrainians, now he's solidified them as one nation with one group of people that I think will fight to the death.
If the Russians have been weakened after 3 years of fighting, with the number of casualties and loss of weapons, can you help us understand the current administration's policy towards Ukraine versus throwing their full support towards Ukraine at the present time?
Well, yeah, the Trump administration is punishing the Ukrainians as a result of what happened in the White House, because they were making demands on Zelensky. He didn't say thank you enough, I guess. And so we're forcing the Ukrainians to come. In fact, they're going to meet tomorrow with Secretary Rubio, the foreign minister of Ukraine will be there, along with the main assistant to President Zelensky will be there in Saudi Arabia. And why? I'm sorry. Where's the questioner? Oh yeah, and you're asking why?
Why isn't the administration? Why isn't our current administration throwing their full support towards Ukraine at a time when Russia is in a weakened state versus handicapped?
Well, you tell me. I don't know. Now, interesting point. I read a very good book, and I'll recommend it to you. The New Cold War by David Sanger. I happened to sit next to him on an airplane 6 months ago, and he asked that same question to General Kelly, General Mattis, General McMaster. What is Putin's hold on Trump? What is it? What is the hold that he has on him? And the answer that David Sanger and these three generals came up with is because Trump admires Putin so much, and he's not gonna put the thumb on Putin. Why does he admire him so much? Because he wants to be a Putin figure in the United States. I'm not saying that, I'm saying what his three national security advisors, Secretary of Defense, and Mr. Sanger, if you read the New York Times, who I respect, the national security writer, and that's the answer, that's my best answer to you.
Okay, I'll keep it. Trump wants to be a dictator. That's what he wants to be. He does not want to be a country that we are. He wants to be able to take charge. That's who he is. And don't anybody understand that. If you think that that guy is for you, he is not for you. He is the worst man ever had. And it's like, to be honest with you, I served in the military for 3 years. I was in Lebanon, and I seen martial law because I was a military policeman. And I want to tell you, that's not any good eating. This is what he wants to do to the United States.
Okay.
He is a bad man, and I hope that the military never forgets their soul, because we're in deep trouble with this man. He's a bad man.
Yeah,
Obviously,
I didn't want to get a discussion about that, but
Right,
but you can't avoid it.
we will keep politics out of this. I'm gonna ask you a question.
Eddie.
Keep it up, all right? Thank you.
We are Americans.
Thank you. So I'm changing the subject a little bit. Len, you and I had a conversation a while ago. And it had to do with doctrine, which I know is one of your favorite subjects. And you were saying that this war has irrevocably changed military doctrine. And from now on, wars will never again be fought the same way, that even tanks are irrelevant, that the two factors that will depend on, that wars will depend on for the future are, number one, drones, which you've already mentioned. And thank goodness Ukraine has a real edge on drones. They have a wonderful manufacturing capability of them. They are smart, they've got a lot of engineers, so that's super. The other factor you mentioned that wars will depend on in the future is cyber. And maybe you could talk a little about that and Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine and their skills in the world of cyber.
All right, I'm not a cyber expert.
That's all right.
But on the other hand, what is cyber? Cyber warfare is, we breaking their communications, reading their intelligence, and vice versa. We have a national security agency, we have the US Cyber Command that does all that sort of stuff. I'm kind of I'm a guy in the weeds at this point. But yeah, cyber warfare is important. But the thing Linda was mentioning is doctrine. Doctrine is, those of you in the Army, Marines, we have a field manual, how to fight. That's doctrine. You open the book, that's how generals and colonels learn. Now, doctrine is based, it's always changing how you fight. It's based on, doctrine is based on new weapons coming in, how you're going to employ them, and how you're going to organize your units to employ that. And take the weapons, take the organization. What do I mean? Divisions, infantry. We don't have divisions in the US Army anymore, by the way. We got rid of them. We fight at the brigade level. We're reforming our infantry divisions right now as we speak. So that's a change. The changes in the US Army now has a whole command, a futures command, setting up, looking at drone warfare. How are they going to take these drones and how are they going to organize US Army units to employ them in warfare? So yeah, the Russo-Ukraine war has changed the way we're going to fight in future wars. That's for sure. Thanks, Linda.
We actually have a question from our Zoom audience, which we're thrilled at. Libby, go ahead.
Sure. It says, assuming the US stays out of the war, how do you see the next several years? Is Europe really able to stand up for Ukraine, not just verbally, but with millions of rounds of artillery, air support, etc.? How do you see the war playing out? By air support, I mean air defense, like Patriot missiles. Seems like the Europeans didn't produce any. Both Ukraine and Russia are exhausted and depleted, yet unwilling to compromise. Does this mean years of stalemate, or how do you feel about that?
Well, that's a,
Big question.
that is
Big question.
$64 million question. Well, I wish I was smart enough to answer as well as the question was phrased. It depends on Europe to a great extent, you know, if they're willing to stand up for Ukraine, hopefully they will. Will the United States maybe, you know, change policy a bit, maybe to favor the Ukrainians as the previous administrations have been? So a lot of open questions on this. And again, where will the weapons come from? You know, if the Europeans are going to furnish the weapons to the Ukrainians, they will. I think to at least this year. What happens next year, I don't know. I don't have a good answer to that questioner.
My question has to do with whether or not you see any danger in the nuclear capabilities of Russia.
You know, I didn't, you know, and Putin's doctrine is if he's threatened, he's gonna use nukes. Okay, what kind of nuclear? We're talking about tactical nukes at this point. What is that? An artillery shell that has a nuclear round explosive on it. It will kill the troops in that 5-mile, 10-mile, 20-mile radius, whatever it is, or a missile loaded with nukes tactically. He's not gonna, that's what we're talking about when he talks about nuclear weapons. Now, I always, you know, for the last year or so, he said, oh, I'm gonna use nukes, I'm gonna use everything I have. And I said, no, he's not. But others have said that he was serious, that if his army was threatened, he would use a nuclear round on the battlefield. So it's not outside the realm of possibilities.
Other than government channels, what is our best way of supporting Ukraine?
Well, let me tell you what I belong to something called Ukrainian American Veterans Post 31, and I'll tell you what we do. We've been raising money to buy solar powered generators for the Ukrainian army. In fact, I bought 2 today on their way to the front line. And why solar powered? Why? Because generators are the most loud, you know, tanks are loud, generators are very loud. And you can see generators run on diesel fuel. They can throw off all sorts of sound. You can see them from the air and so on. So the solar power ones, and what do they do with them? I don't know, but I think maybe they use them to juice up their drones. But there's a great organization called Razom, R-A-Z-O-M, that raises money for humanitarian aid. Oh, by the way, as not a sidelight on the Ukraine war, one of the negotiators that the Trump administration is sending to Ukraine is a Lieutenant General Kellogg, who some of my friends know. He's a West Point graduate. I won't go into that, but otherwise, his daughter runs a big humanitarian foundation in Ukraine. I don't know the name of it, but I'm just little story here. What else? Sandra, does anything come to mind? I know in our little church in Jamaica Plains, St. Andrew, we've raised $150,000 for aid to Ukraine that we give out to different charities in Ukraine. The chaplain runs something called the ELOS Foundation, E-L-O-S. That's for the battered woman that he's taking care of. So that's the best answer I have. You know, when our church, there are about I would say there are several thousand Ukrainian refugees in the Boston area that come to our church, and we give them a few bucks to get started. I remember one story about a year ago. A woman came into church. And she was a refugee, and she went, I could hear the conversation. She went to the priest and said, Father, please pray for my husband. He died last week on the battlefield. And, you know, I don't know if we gave her any money, but that's what we do within our church. I don't think there's any more questions.
Any more questions? We'd like to have 1 or 2 more to wrap up. Okay, Phil. All right, and sir, you're gonna have the honor of the last question after Phil.
Can you talk about the various National Guard, state National Guard organizations and the partnership that they've had? You alluded to it.
Excellent question. I was involved in that in the Pentagon. In fact, I linked up Ukraine with the California National Guard. You don't know this, but one of the great organizations in the United States Armed Forces. In fact, the oldest one, it goes back in 1636, is the Massachusetts National Guard. That fought at Lexington and Concord, by the way. Massachusetts is lined up with Kenya and Paraguay. And we send training teams for their army there. But in addition to California National Guard training, part of the Ukrainian Army and some Air Force training as well. Since 2015 to 2022, the U.S. National Guard has had a brigade in Ukraine for 6 months at a time, constantly training Ukrainian soldiers and lieutenants at the junior level how to fight. And you can see the payoff right now. So every state National Guard is paired with another country in the world, friendly country, obviously, for training and this sort of thing. I remember going to the Baltic countries, doing some training there myself over the years. But it's called Partnership for Peace. Maybe you want, and what is it involved in? It involves U.S. allies and friendlies that we try to train up their armies. So Kenya is also involved in, if you don't know, in sending thousands of policemen to Haiti. So I don't think we got involved with them, but that's the things the U.S. National Guard does. The other thing is not well known. The entire right now, Massachusetts National Guard has 3 battalions being deployed to Poland and the Mideast. They're coming back, 3 more are going out. So every state National Guard is still on active duty somewhere. Every state has a National Guard unit somewhere in the world. Some governors have elected to send their National Guard units to the Texas border, small ones, but anyway. So yeah, that's a great question. Thank you.
And the final is Guy.
My question is about Zelensky specifically. I mean, my reading of Trump's behavior, including asking a lot, ordering the refugees to return to Ukraine, is that he wants Zelensky gone. If that were to happen, is there really anybody there who could replace Zelensky in a credible way?
Yeah, right now there can't be elections in Ukraine because the Constitution says no elections during a time of martial law, which means war. So Zelensky won't resign. I'm not saying he will never resign. Other politicians and non-politicians in the background that can be capable of presidency. Yeah, there are. The former commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, the General Zelensky. He's the ambassador to the Ukrainian ambassador to the UK right now. His troops love him. And I could see him as a future president. The problem with the presidents of Ukraine since 1991, they've been really failures as leaders, failures to reorganize the country, failures to root out corruption, which was a big issue in Ukraine. Zelensky's been the best. He's a great wartime leader. Does he have his faults? Yes. Did he make mistakes in the beginning of the war? Yes. But Putin is insisting on Zelensky be gone, and so we'll see if the Trump administration goes along with that. But I don't think Zelensky's going to resign. So. Last question. Thank you. Thank you for your attention, by the way. Appreciate it.
Both the general and I want to thank you for an excellent discussion. Thank you for your interest, for your incredible questions. This is a pretty serious topic.
It is.
You did a wonderful job
Thank you, Linda.
explaining it. We're so happy to have him back. By the way, he was scheduled to be here last year and he broke his hip 5 days before his talk. But here he is back. You'd never know it. Hale and hearty. So, this concludes our presentation. We hope to see you all on April 14th. The Road to Concord. Let's learn about those brass cannons. Thank you so much for being here. Good afternoon, everyone.